Good evening. It's a great privilege to be here, to be together with some familiar friends and to see new faces. Thank you very much on a beautiful autumn night for coming out to be together, to think about some very, very hard topics, especially the cost of war. There's a book that I'm going to confess I haven't read all of it. It's called Lark and Termite, and it's by a woman named Jane Ann Phillips. And she sets her story up so that one of her main characters is in Korea. The war is going on in Korea, and this young American soldier wants to go home so badly. He misses his sweetheart, he's in love, he's sick to death of war, he's war weary. And at one point he says, the planes always come, like planets on rotation. A timed bloodletting with different excuses. I'll just say that again. The planes always come, like planets on rotation. A timed bloodletting with different excuses. I was in Pakistan fairly recently. This was end of May, beginning of June. And a man had actually walked a long distance and taken 2 buses so that he could tell us his eyewitness account of one of those timed bloodlettings. It had happened in the town of Khaisor, and that's in North Waziristan. And it's a town that's so remote, there are no roads that even lead up to it. 500 people live in the whole town. But as would be typical from time immemorial, people in this town had an obligation, a custom, but it was also an obligation. You don't question this custom. That if a stranger comes to your door and knocks on the door, if you have food inside your home, if you have water or tea to offer, you do so. I mean, it's not like you can say, well, the 7-Eleven is that way, a Motel 6 is over there. There's no road leading up to the town. Only 500 people in the town, and their customary obligation, even if it's their enemy, is not to let the person go forth and possibly thirst or starve into sickness or death. And so it happened on May 14th that 3 strangers came to Khaisor, and they went to a particular house and they knocked on the door, and they were sat down on the floor. They were treated as guests. They were fed. They were given something to drink, and they were long gone. They left. At 4:30 in the morning, a United States-operated drone with weapons affixed to it, so in that case we know it was being operated out of the CIA base in Langley, Virginia, had gotten information, if you will, perhaps from another drone, perhaps operated out of another airbase, but this drone had the information about this particular house being the target. At 4:30 in the morning, Hellfire missiles were shot into the house. 14 people were killed instantly. 2 of them were village elders. Children were dismembered, many wounded. And so I asked our friend who was telling this to me, who had survived, what do you do if there's no fire station, there aren't any EMTs? And he began to tell me very rapidly exactly what they did. I was wearing the tabutta, the long scarf that Pakistani women traditionally wear. And he said, yes, madame, you see, we take this scarf and we wrap it around as tight as we can to stop the bleeding. And I could imagine my white scarf becoming scarlet red, stained with blood in seconds. And then he said they put the people on their shoulders who've survived, and going over rough terrain, they try to get to the road as fast as they can to flag down a vehicle. Well, this was early in the morning hours, and finally a car came, and breathlessly they told what had happened. But the driver, knowing that the drone might very well still be circling overhead, was so terrified that if he became involved in what would appear on the screen, well, he sped away. And there they were, with people still bleeding profusely. My friend told me that people do have cell phones, and that the word goes out to villages 3 villages away. This bloody thing has happened again. And people come for the funeral prayers from far away, even if they don't know personally the person who has been killed. And then he told me that it's gotten to the point where people are nevertheless afraid to be gathered together in groups because they think, well, this could occasion a drone making an attack. And if the children hear the drone overhead, they scatter. They don't want to play together for fear of the drones. And when I came back to the United States, I read in the newspaper on June 24th about a group of people who had gathered for a funeral. It was in a village called Lataka. 5 men, quite possibly all Taliban leaders, had been killed, and people came for the funerals. And as would happen in my family and maybe in yours, the closer relatives stayed. They stayed throughout the afternoon and into the early evening. There were 60 people gathered, and a drone attacked those 60 people. 35 people were killed, 10 of them were children. And the word goes out, this bloody thing has happened again. And we will be told that this is for our national security. But I'm not at all persuaded. And I think that the drones can collect a great deal of information. It's astonishing, really. I mean, they're 2 miles up. I was in Gaza while the Operation Cast Lead bombing was happening, and believe me, when I heard those drones circling overhead, I thought, well, they're probably collecting information about every house on this block. But what the drones can't tell us is about the poverty that afflicts so many of the people below. When I was in Pakistan, the Pakistani government had been persuaded but also pushed by the United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and other authorities. They were told, look, you better dislodge, crush, eliminate the Taliban, who had gone into the northern part of Pakistan in the Swat Valley. And actually, there had been an agreement with the Pakistani government that the Pakistani government would just back off and the Taliban could establish the Sharia law. But the Taliban very brazenly defied the government and spread out to Lower Dir and to Buner. And at that point, the United States said, look, they're getting too powerful. You are a nuclear-armed state. There was a lot of alarm about what would happen if the Taliban gained more power. They had to be shown, they had to be forced out. And so there began a military offensive which occasioned 3.1 million people being displaced. Some of us can remember Hurricane Katrina. Some of you have gone down to try to help people. We know a little bit about what rapid displacements mean. This was in 10 days. 2 million of those 3.1 million people were displaced. They had to flee from their homes. I talked with people who had walked for days, carrying their loved ones on their shoulders, who had just grabbed what they could of belongings because the military curfew was lifted for only a few hours. We talked to people who talked about trying to build shallow graves for people who'd already been killed by the military offensive, and people who'd seen the helicopters overhead and were afraid for their lives. And then when they got to wherever they were staying, they were still afraid because the water was impure, because there weren't latrines set up, because there wasn't enough food. And the children were just knocked out. They weren't just dehydrated, they were down and out for the count. And the men were so alarmed. They were afraid that maybe their livestock would have thirsted or starved to death, and they didn't have some kind of buffer. They didn't have another job or livelihood. Others were afraid that their crops would be destroyed. They couldn't harvest the crops. What would they eat? What would they sell if they were vegetable vendors? There were others who were very afraid that their shops would be demolished, that their houses would be destroyed. These were the poorer people, 70% of Pakistan's population, and also 70% of Afghanistan's population. People who, among the 2.6 million, are never going to get out of debt. They're permanent wage slaves. They can work their whole lives long, and they'll never be able to work their way out of debt. People whose literacy skills are low. people whose expectations in life are not so great. And so into some of these small towns might come some very buff young men with long curly hair who seem to be well-fed, who seem to have a big pocketbook or purse, and they start to say, look, you don't have to be so weary and impoverished. This isn't what Allah wanted for you. They start to talk to people about how they can build a school for the little boys and give them a fresh change of clothes and 2 meals a day and teach them to read and write. And even the women would begin to say, yes, this is a very good idea. These Taliban groups would come in and kind of do a Robin Hood analysis and say, we could force the landlord, we could force the moneylenders, right out of town. And the Taliban would gain some popularity. And as people narrated it to us, often then, once they got into positions of power in the town, then their power could become very abusive. It would turn. And if anybody expressed opposition, they could be beaten or even killed, even beheaded. And I think that I've heard often when I get a chance to meet with communities like yours, great concern for those who would be at risk of abusive, horrible, even ghastly practices by Taliban groups. But I think we have to also remember in sorrow and in compassion that when one of our predator drones flies over a region and fires a Hellfire missile into a home, that's ghastly. When people are dismembered, that's like torture. When they're bleeding to death and their relatives can't help them, that's a horrific experience. And this is also part of what is being told amongst people so that they begin to feel a desire for revenge. They begin to feel huge antagonism. In Pakistan, the approval rate for the United States is 16%. Well, these are things that the drones, for all their surveillance capacity, simply can't tell us. They can't help us to feel sorrow over the war. But I believe that the cost of these wars has become so very, very high that the reason for sorrow is almost beyond words. I want to tell you about a story that I read. I didn't witness this, but it also didn't appear very far and wide in the United States press. You'd have to go to the Agence France Presse, April 8th, to learn about a day when United States troops perhaps got bad information. Maybe it came through torturing somebody, maybe it came through paying a bribe, maybe it came through someone studying, surveillance that came from a drone. But anyway, they were given information that a particular house in the province of Khost, in a village called Ali Dawa, was the home of, if you will, a bad guy. And so the United States troops had worked out a strategy so that US troops would occupy the house next door and go up on the rooftop. And then another group of US troops went to the home of the bad guy. Now it turned out this was the home of an artillery commander in the Afghan army. His name was Awal Khan, and he was a very respected military figure in the eyes of a lot of the American military. Well, who knew that it was his home? And so the United States troops burst into the home, and the people inside were frightened. They thought, these are robbers. So they ran upstairs, and as soon as they came out on their own rooftop, the United States soldiers on the opposite rooftop opened fire, and they killed Brigadier General Awal Khan's wife, his brother, his 17-year-old daughter, Naja, his 15-year-old son, Aimel. Then his cousin, hearing this racket, came running down the street. She was 9 months pregnant. They opened fire on her. The baby in her womb was riddled with bullets and died. And when Lieutenant Colonel Greg Julian realized the enormity of the mistake that had been made, he wrote a letter, a heartfelt letter. He said he was sorry. He said a tragic mistake was made. The sorrow of war is felt. Where you stand determines what you see. But at our great distance, I wonder how much sorrow we feel. May I offer another example, again coming from Gaza. There was a woman I'd met, Saba Abu Halimi. When I met her, her arm looked like it was a beehive. It was wrapped from shoulder to wrist in many, many, many bandages. And Dr. Nafaz Abu Shabham and Dr. Atala Taratsi had introduced us to her because in the Shifa hospital, she had survived a white phosphorus attack. And I honestly wondered if maybe medications had caused her to be unable to distinguish reality from nightmare. Her story sounded so gruesome. And so after talking to her, and really, I held her in my arms and I found $200 in my bag and gave it to her because she was asking, what would she do? Where would she go? We asked our cab driver friend Nabil, could he please take us up to her village, Al-Atatra, in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And he didn't really want to do it because the roads were all cratered and he was afraid his cab would be ruined for good. But he also knew that we were only there for a short time and we wanted to better understand whether or not this story was true. So we went to Al-Atatra and it seemed almost uncanny. So many people already knew exactly where to find her home. And we met her son and he corroborated her story. I gave my notes to somebody from the LA Times, and I think he gave them to the New York Times. When I was back in the United States, I read a much more full account of what had happened on that day to Saba Abu Halimi. Sabrina Tavernus writes on February 3rd that the white phosphorus tank-fired missiles were intended to obscure troop movements. You can imagine this cloud of thick white smoke. But when those elements breathed their fire and storm into the hallway of Saba Abu Halimi's home, they clung to the hair and the clothing of her husband, her baby daughter, and 3 children, burning them to death. Now, as it happened, the invading Israeli ground troop soldiers needed to occupy, they believed, a house that was a little higher than the other houses in the village so that they could have a better view. So when we went into her home and her son showed us the room where 22 people had huddled, where there were no windows, where they thought they would be more safe, he then showed us the next room and it was ransacked. The cabinets had been emptied out on the floor and the furniture was turned over and it really looked kind of trashed. But then he pointed to the wall and I read in perfect Arabic script, written with magic marker, Min Jeish Israelin, from the Israeli army, Nahnu Nsifa. We're sorry. And I believe it. I believe that was written in genuine sorrow. I don't think without sorrow we can estimate the cost of this war. There are many facts and figures to think about. People were so kind to help me put together a little bit of a visual display. And I just want to say that in the picture you see here from a United Nations High Commission of Refugees camp, you see children gathered in almost every experience I've ever had. When you go where there are children and you have a camera, the kids will say, Sora, Sora, or in some way say they want their picture taken. There's not a smile on the faces of any of these children. And this is as the sun went down over what was really one of the better off places. Even though people were so afraid of getting cholera, there weren't any latrines yet, and women had to put their waste in small holes that they dug in the corner of their tent, and then late at night when the sun had gone down, they'd take it to bury it elsewhere, but they weren't at all confident that they were going to survive. And their children themselves were hungry. These little kids, they're not taking a nap. I wrote an article about them and called it Down and Out in Shah Mansour, along with my friend Dan Pearson. These kids had to be held by their parents when they did get up because they were so dehydrated and they were so weakened after what they'd gone through. Very, very traumatizing, and the parents were so worried for them. Well, it seems to me that it's important to try to look at the reality in Afghanistan, you see all these provinces. There are provinces then divided into districts, and there are 364 districts in Afghanistan. In 2003, 30 of those districts were controlled by Taliban groups. Now it's up to 164. It wouldn't be the case that in every single one of those districts, the Taliban coerced the control. Sometimes people said we'd rather be aligned with the Taliban than with our own government because they believe their government is corrupt. Or they'd rather be with the Taliban than with the infidels from far away who are bombing them. That's us. And there's a good poll that was done by the BBC in January, and then again more recently it was done again. What do Afghans want? 80 to 88% of the people said they don't want the Taliban. But 60 to 66% have said that they don't want occupation to continue, they don't want the war to continue, and they would prefer that there be negotiation with the Taliban and a settlement. It's not the case that you can decide that there should be one central governance in Kabul for all of these different districts and provinces. It never has been the case before. And for the United States to say, we're going to come in and fix Afghanistan and be a nation-building country, well, General Petraeus himself has pointed out that if you're going to do a counterinsurgency campaign, it takes about 30 years, and you have to have 25 soldiers on the ground for every 1,000 people. There are 32 million people living in Afghanistan. If we do the math, that means we would need to have 687,000 soldiers. It costs $1 billion for every 1,000 soldiers. Sure, China and Russia might sit back and say, let the United States spend itself into oblivion. But are we to say that we're helping the children? Why not, if we want to help with water purification, electricity, food distribution, healthcare delivery, put the resources and the money right into that, give it to the United Nations and to other NGOs, but don't train people to kill and send over so many weapons that we look like invading Martians. And do you know it costs $400 for a gallon of gasoline to get to Afghanistan? How could it be that a gallon of gasoline would cost $400? Because there are so many payoffs along the way as it comes in through Pakistan, goes up through Pakistan, goes through the Khyber Pass and down into the villages. We're already negotiating with the Taliban. Why do you think the gas costs $400 for a gallon? Is this something the United States begins to think it can afford? And people ask, why? Why are we there? Well, this map appeared in the New York Times, and people in Pakistan who were amongst the elite, the affluent, the educated, all knew about this map. And if you look at it carefully, it's the imagined map that a CIA analyst developed for what would happen if Pakistan were destabilized. And do you see the area of Free Baluchistan? There is a separatist movement in Baluchistan. If Baluchistan broke away from Pakistan, Pakistan would no longer share a border with Iran. And there are some in the United States, for geopolitical reasons, who might think, well, that's a good idea. Notice the border between Pakistan and China. If Afghanistan extended its territory, kind of curling over Pakistan, then you'd eliminate the China-Pakistan border. And there are some within the State Department and the think tanks who think, well, that would be a good idea. Because there is the concern about the flow of resources. There's a kind of a flip journalist, his name is Pepe Escobar, and he's called the whole region Pipelineistan. And his thought is that there's such a desire to control the pricing and the flow of the natural gas and the oil, maybe not so much to bring it into your gas tanks and your home and your heating fuel, but so that China and Russia won't have an economic competitive edge over the United States because of the control of these resources. And so we have fighting, intense fighting going on in North and South Waziristan right now. The farmers and welders and shop owners and people that were destitute and already poor, whom I spoke with from the Swat Valley region, have gone back to their homes. But it's so curious to me, very seasoned and smart people like Richard Holbrooke have been slapping the Pakistani generals on the back and saying that was a great job, that was a successful military offensive. But then you read the articles that are coming from the region and it doesn't make any sense. Jane Perlez wrote in the New York Times, 251 corpses strewn on the streets of Mingora, the main city in the Swat Valley. And parents were telling their children in some of the small towns that they couldn't play in the river like they usually would because corpses were floating downstream. And you read about people going to the police station saying, do you have my brother? Do you have our father? Do you have my husband? And they may be told, no, no, and then the corpse is dropped off at their doorstep. And there has been a video circulating around. A young Pakistani friend of mine wrote to me and said, Kathy, put this out on Facebook. And I looked at it, and I lasted maybe 3 minutes. I was in Union Station in Washington, D.C., shaking, looking at this on this computer, because it shows Pakistani military beating a confession out of one prisoner while the others watch. And he's beaten and he's kicked to the ground, and they keep asking him, are you Taliban? Are you Taliban? And then he finally says yes, and then they beat him until he confesses the names of other people. And then they bring out the next prisoner for the beating. The monstrous. The idea that wars are successful, it escapes the sorrow. War is counterproductive. It's futile. It doesn't solve problems. And in the United States today, we don't have the moral authority to be waging these wars. We don't have the financial ability to wage these wars, and we don't have the military resources. But even if we did, we're at that point where I believe if we push and push hard, just as slavery went into the dustbin of history, we can send war into the dustbin of history. We can be the people who start that movement for the grandchildren you love and say this is the end of war, but it requires our sorrow. Do you know there's a song that was written, when Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. And maybe we all sang it when we were kids, but it was predated by an earlier song, an Irish ballad that sang about the tragedy and the sorrow of war. And I'd like to just spend a little time with that ballad tonight. I should have made copies for everybody, but I'll ask you just to allow me to take part of that song with you tonight. With your drums and guns and guns and drums, hurroo, hurroo. With your guns and drums and drums and guns, hurroo, hurroo. With your guns and drums and drums and guns, the enemy nearly slew you. Oh, my darling dear, you look so queer. Johnny, we hardly knew you. Where are your eyes that looked so mild? Hurroo, hurroo. Where are your eyes that looked so mild? Hurroo, hurroo. Where are your eyes that looked so mild? Before my heart you first beguiled, oh, why did you run from me and the child? Johnny, we hardly knew you. And it goes on, verse after verse. The returned soldier has lost his legs, lost his arms, lost an eye. And sometimes the returned soldiers are close to losing their minds. They know the sorrow of war. And we too, I believe, know it. And so when we think of Jane Ann Phillips's line, the planes always come, like planets on rotation, a timed bloodletting with different excuses. Our role, our job as adults, is to go to the leaders on Capitol Hill, make sure we get to the university leaders, the high school leaders, the principals, the priests, make sure we get to the community leaders, the media leaders, and let them know that we know there is no excuse. I invite you so sincerely to join our Peaceable Assembly campaign plans. We want to assemble peaceably in elected representatives' offices, and we invite you to come and join us in Washington, D.C. anytime between January 19th and February 2nd. And that's a stretch of time when President Barack Obama will be preparing his State of the Union address, when the Obama administration will have been in power for 1 year, and when on February 2nd, the new Defense Authorization Spending Bill will be introduced into the Congress and the Senate. And I believe that the amount of money that we can afford, the amount of United States productivity and wealth that we can afford to meet the costs of war, the $3.2 trillion that Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes say that ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan will cost, the amount is zero. So let us put our lives in alignment with our deepest beliefs, with what we are privileged to have been taught, many of us, in our earlier years. Put our lives in alignment with those beliefs, have a great commitment to the children who can't quite take action right now. You can't tell the 6-year-olds to sort it out. And let's bind ourselves together to know that there is no excuse for war and that we can be a people of peace. Thank you very much. It happened that I was in Jenin, in the Jenin camp, when it was really reduced to rubble. And we thought, surely this is going to be caught by the news media and people are going to know that crimes against humanity were committed. But it went right off the news radar screen in days. And I was also in Lebanon in the summer of 2006 during that war, and when we saw the villages south of the Litani River, again reduced to rubble, 1,200 people killed, and I thought, this is surely going to occasion studies and reports and war crimes questions. And it went right off the radar screen. This time, although the Goldstone report has been treated dismissively by our Congress and Senate, I don't think Gaza is going off the radar screen. George Galloway's got another convoy that's going to be coming in through Syria, entering into Gaza. Global Exchange and other groups have formed a very fine coalition with Code Pink and others to have a walk that will walk into Gaza. And that begins to mark the date when the 22-day campaign against Gaza, an air campaign, began. You know, there were 100 pre-planned targets. And of those pre-planned targets, 88 planes were assigned. The jet fuel came free of charge from the United States. And in 220 seconds, every single one of those targets were hit. A surprise attack that began 22 ensuing days of bombing. When I was there, a bomb fell and exploded once every 11 minutes, from 11 until 1 in the morning, and then we could sleep until 3, and then it started again. Once every 11 minutes, you could time it. I don't know anything about military, really, but even I knew that was a Hellfire missile from an Apache helicopter. Oh, that one was a 500-pound bomb from an F-16. You could actually begin to distinguish the kinds of bombs that were being used. And then when we came out from under the bombing and went to the Shifa hospital, I actually met a Dr. Saeed Abu Hassan, who was from the neighborhood next door to me in Chicago. And he's a Palestinian doctor who had gone to finish his studies in the Emirates, a very seasoned emergency room, ICU doctor. And so we asked him to tell us a little bit about his experiences because he was getting ready to leave. And he told us that there were people dying at their feet in pools of blood, and that as they were trying to perform the surgeries, sometimes they'd have to walk away from a patient because they were breathing in the white phosphorus fumes. And he said that the white phosphorus was like nothing he'd ever experienced before because the necrotic tissue would develop, a blackened, ashy tissue, but then if they either walked away from the patient or went to work on another part of the patient's body, these teams of surgeons, then they'd look at the tissue they just removed and there was new blackened, necrotic, ashy tissue, because when the white phosphorus is exposed to oxygen, it continues to burn. And he told us about how he was familiar with pulling shrapnel out of people's limbs in a war zone, but that in this case, the dense inert metal explosion bombs are so strong and intense with tungsten that explodes, that people's limbs were just lacerated. And I asked him, well, what should I tell people when I'm back in your neighborhood in Chicago? And he started into this tirade. He said, well, you have to tell people that people here don't have prostheses, they don't have rehab clinics, they need all of it. And then he said, no, I am completely wrong. Just you tell them American money paid for these weapons. Now, you know, a lot of times people said, look, the Palestinians were digging tunnels. You bet they were. I woke up one morning and I thought I was at the dentist's office. And then I realized, oh my God, that's a tunnel that's being dug very close to where I'm staying. We were right on the border between Egypt and Gaza. But you know, Jim and I and others, Len, we went to Iraq and we saw people after they were subjected to year after year of a comprehensive state of siege. If I could have dug a tunnel getting into Iraq, I would have clawed my way through a tunnel. You want to get what people need. And so yeah, through the tunnels come diesel fuel. Babies' diapers, pots and pans, you name it. It's like this whole shopping system with 1,500 tunnels. Some of them have tile roofs. Some of them have pulley systems. Some of them are very primitive. And yes, maybe some Kalashnikov rifles and bullets and rocket components come through those tunnels. You'll never hear me step away from my pacifism to say that's okay. But if we were going to build a tunnel to accommodate what the United States has sent in terms of weaponry to Israel, that tunnel would have to be the size of the Grand Canyon. It would have to be the eighth wonder of the world. Can you imagine a tunnel to accommodate the D-9 bulldozers, the F-16 airplanes, the Apache helicopters, the Hellfire missiles, the 500-pound bombs? Can you imagine what kind of tunnel would have to accommodate the Joint Defense Ammunition kits? What kind of tunnel you'd have to build to be able to manage the drone aircraft that the United States has jointly helped Israel to build? I haven't even started on the 200 to 400 thermonuclear weapons in Israel. It's a fragile situation, and we're arming people further and further. $30 billion the United States gave in 2007 to spend over a 10-year period. And then we gave more money to Kuwait, and then more money to Saudi Arabia. Buy weapons, so what? So we can be the world's biggest weapon exporter, 68% of the world's weapon sales coming from here, and we think we're creating national security, we're creating empire. Do you want this for your grandchildren? Of course not. That we should be hated and feared all around the world as a menace. But we can't expect the young children to sort it out. Won't they be asking us, where were you? Didn't you want to try and change it while you still could? Do we want General Petraeus as a future president? Because the military is gaining and gaining and gaining. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, it's like a demonic suction cup. You remember Madeleine Albright said, 1998, on a NBC Today news show, she was asked, would the United States invade Iraq? She said, if we have to use force, we must. We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller than others. We see further. Is that our mirror? Are we the indispensable nation? Are we always to claim exceptionalism? President Barack Obama said the United States will not tolerate the killing of innocent civilians. But we have to look in the mirror because we not only tolerate it, we pay for it, we cause it. So the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in the Beyond Vietnam speech laid it out for us in the Riverside Parish Church. He subtitled his speech, A Time to Break Silence. He called on people to love the Viet Cong. To love the Viet Cong. How do you do that? You look for the humanity in your adversary, and you try to see yourself as you're seen by your adversary. And you try to practice a neighborliness that goes beyond neighborhood, state, nation, and race. That's what he called us to do. And so we have to try to see ourselves as we're seen by the Taliban groups. We have to try to see the humanity in these Taliban groups, and I think it means try to take a good, square, direct look at poverty. And if people tell us that you're going to abandon the women, well, when you take that good, square look at poverty, there are women today whose husbands are in Taliban groups or in prisons or have already been killed, or maybe they don't know where they are. And so it's a woman alone with children, and she's poor, she can't read. How is she going to get money into the home? So some of the women make rugs, they weave on looms all day long. But when they do that, they can't afford daycare or nursery care for the children. They have to keep the children quiet so they can work, so they can feed the children. And they give the children opium. 44% of Afghanistan's children suffer from stunted growth. 33% of the children aged 1 to 3 are underweight. They're going to bed hungry at night. Now, if we want to feed and get clean water, if we want to care for these our neighbors, we can't let Boeing and Lockheed and Martin Marietta and General Electric and General Dynamics and Raytheon and all the companies that make these huge profits, we can't do both. You can't feed God and mammon. We can't keep on feeding this military. It'll suck you dry. You can't keep doing it and still have a sustainable world. We know the terrors we face. Environmental degradation, scarcity of water, depletion of fossil fuels, global climate change. We need the scientists to get right on those problems, not to be building more drones. You know, this new generation of drones they're talking about can release bees. And the bees are so tiny, these robotic bees can come in through your window and explode. Do we think other countries aren't going to get their hands on this kind of technology? Do we think this is enhancing our national security? Could I just ask George and Judy to stand up? Look at the t-shirts they're wearing. Ground the drones, and if you don't mind turning around, lest we reap the whirlwind. Thank you, George and Judy, who came out to Creech Air Force Base and vigiled, and Judy got arrested, and we've got vigils going on in Syracuse because they're bringing drone technology to Hancock Field, so near to you. On November 15th, there's a chance to gather people for a regional action. There's so many opportunities to stand up, speak up, go into Maurice Hinchy's office. He's such a good man. He'll listen to you. You're his constituents. Make sure you're going into Schumer's office. I don't know what kind of guy he is, but you're his constituents. You know, we really have this chance, and we might not have such a chance at other points in time. Why is the Bagram prison doubling in size? They're building the Bagram prison where prisoners have less rights than in Guantanamo. Why are they bringing in so many new prisoners and doubling it in size? And what kind of oversight will there be inside that prison? And has he seen Taxi to the Dark Side about the previous history of that prison? And I think to ask him why it is that we're supposed to be spending $4 billion a month, and that if, in fact, the United States moves in the direction of arming and equipping an Afghan security, police, and military apparatus, this will cost the taxpayers $4 billion every year just for that. And why should we be the ones who are creating a military authoritarian governance in another country? You know, we created the Mujahideen 30 years ago. We gave them the weapons, we built their training camps, we trained them, and now they've got their weapons aimed back at us. Do we think the Iraqis are going to love us so much after we starve their children that 30 years from now, if they get their hands on enough weaponry, they might not want to shoot us? It's called blowback by some people. It's a horrible word. I don't like it. But I like the idea of peacemaking, where we deliberately say, we don't want empire, we don't want it so badly, we want to live more simply. I've tried to stay off planes as best I can. I know every megabus route, Amtrak, you name it. It's kind of a drag, but you know, this is what we have to do. Live more simply, share our resources, ask other countries, what's the price for your fossil fuels? They're yours. What's a fair price? And if we think the price is too high, we use less. I wonder if the international community isn't trying to give our community a leg up, saying, look, you know, a lot of energy and money was spent to put Barack Obama into the White House. And now he's facing off with generals and major companies with huge amounts of leverage. And maybe even our efforts that got him into office in the first place, and people are kind of wearied and tired out, but I think we should think the people that are under the bombs are a lot more weary and tired out than we are. But maybe there's an international heave-ho that could help President Barack Obama stay with some fundamental truths, which I think he does believe in. I would not want to see him be a one-term president, but I do believe that if there's no public option, and if the war in Afghanistan continues, I don't think he'll succeed. And I'm very worried about the idea that the Republicans themselves may be anxious about Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann and some of these folks might put forward General Petraeus. And then we would have a military, industrial, congressional, media complex more pronounced than what we already have. I want to push the pacifist option, at least amongst those who are part of faith-based groups. That much we can expect. I mean, the idea that the Vatican right now is preoccupying itself with what the nuns have done, without learning from what the nuns have done. They never showed the slightest interest in acquiring personal wealth. They shared belongings in common. They served the poor. They lived exemplary lives. And the Vatican leadership is concentrating on, I don't know, taking their real estate or something. I don't know what they're trying to do with that investigation, but they haven't spoken out in a pronounced and a clear way to say we can put an end to war. And so I think, we ought ourselves to hold on to the peacemaking brief, if you will. And I don't think the militarists will ever be able to solve our problems, because so much of their energy goes into designing and carrying out projects meant to destroy buildings and kill people and contribute toward that spiraling rate of violence.